The Almond Tree. Part 1. My old friend, the Count, as we used to call him, made very strange acquaintances at times. Let but a man have plausibility, a point of view, a crotchet, an enthusiasm, he would find in him an eager and exhilarating listener. And though he was often deceived and disappointed in his finds, the Count had a heart proof against lasting disillusionment. I confess, however, that these planetary cronies of his were rather disconcerting at times, and I own that meeting him one afternoon in the busy High Street, with a companion on his arm, even more than usually voluble and odd, I own I crossed the road to avoid meeting the pair. But the Count's eyes had been too sharp for me. He twitted me unmercifully with my snobbishness. "I am afraid we must have appeared to avoid you to-day," he said, and received my protestations with contemptuous indifference. But the next afternoon we took a walk together over the heath, and perhaps the sunshine, something in the first freshness of the May weather, reminded him of bygone days. "You remember that rather out-of-the-world friend of mine yesterday that so shocked your spruce proprieties, Richard? Well, I'll tell you a story." As closely as I can recall this story of the Count's childhood, I have here related it. I wish, though, I had my old friend's gift for such things. Then, perhaps, his story might retain something of the charm in the reading which he gave to it in the telling. Perhaps that charm lies wholly in the memory of his voice, his companionship, his friendship. To revive these, what task would be a burden? The house of my first remembrance, the house that to my last hour on earth will seem home to me, stood in a small green hollow on the verge of a wide heath. Its 5 upper windows faced far eastwards towards the weather-cocked tower of a village, which rambled down the steep inclination of a hill. And walking in its green old garden, ah, Richard, the crocuses, the wallflowers, the violets! You could see in the evening the standing fields of corn, and the dark furrows where the evening star was stationed, and a little to the south, upon a crest, a rambling wood of fir trees and bracken. The house, the garden, the deep quiet orchard, all had been a wedding gift to my mother from a great-aunt, a very old lady in a kind of turban, whose shrewd eyes used to watch me out of her picture, sitting in my high cane chair at mealtimes, with not a little keenness, sometimes I fancied with a faint derision. Here passed by, to the singing of the lark, and the lamentation of autumn wind and rain, the first long 9 of all these heaped-up inextricable years. Even now my heart leaps up with longing to see again with those untutored eyes the lofty clouds of evening, to hear again, as then I heard it, the 2 small notes of the yellow hammer piping from his green spray. I remember every room of the old house, the steep stairs, the cool apple-scented pantry. I remember the cobbles by the scullery, the well, my old dead raven, the bleak and whistling elms. But best of all, I remember the unmeasured splendor of the heath, with its gorse and its deep canopy of sunny air, the haven of every wild bird of the morning. Martha Rodd was a mere prim snippet of a maid then, pale and grave, with the large contemplative Puritan eyes. Mrs. Ryder, in her stiff blue Martial print and twisted gold brooch, was cook. And besides these, there was only old Thomas the gardener, as out of doors and as distantly seen a creature as a dryad, my mother, and that busy-minded little boy, agog in wits and stomach and spirit, myself. For my father seemed but a familiar guest in the house, a guest ever eagerly desired and welcome, but none too eager to remain. He was a dark man with gray eyes and a long chin, a face unusually impassive, unusually mobile. Just as his capricious mood suggested, our little household was dejected or wildly gay. I never shall forget the spirit of delight he could conjure up at a whim, when my mother would go singing up and down stairs, and in her tiny parlor, and Martha, in perfect content, would prattle endlessly on to the cook, basting the twirling sirloin, while I watched in the firelight. And the long summer evenings, too, when my father would find a secret, a magic, a mystery in everything, and we would sit together in the orchard while he told me tales, with the small green apples overhead, and beyond contorted branches the first golden twilight of the moon. It's an old picture now, Richard, but true to the time. My father's will, his word, his caprice, his frown, these were the tables of the law in that small household. To my mother he was the very meaning of her life. Only that little boy was in some wise independent, busy, inquisitive, docile, sedate, though urged to a bitterness of secret rebellion at times. In his childhood he experienced such hours of distress as the years do not in mercy bring again to a heart that may analyze as well as remember. Yet there also sank to rest the fountain of life's happiness. In among the gorse bushes were the green mansions of the fairies. Along the furrows before his adventurous eyes stumbled crooked gnomes, hopped bewitched robins. Ariel trebled in the sunbeams and glanced from the dewdrops, and he heard the echo of distant and magic waters in the falling of the rain. But my father was never long at peace in the house. Nothing satisfied him. He must needs be at an extreme. And if he was compelled to conceal his discontent, there was something so bitter and imperious in his silence, so scornful of sarcasm in his speech, that we could scarcely bear it. And the knowledge of the influence he had over us served only at such times to sharpen his contempt. I remember one summer's evening we had been gathering strawberries. I carried a little wicker basket and went rummaging under the aromatic leaves, calling ever and again my mother to see the tremendous berry I had found. Martha was busy beside me, vexed that her 2 hands could not serve her master quick enough, and in a wild race with my mother, my father helped us pick. At every ripest one he took her in his arms to force it between her lips, and of all those pecked by the birds he made a rhymed offering to Pan. And when the sun had descended behind the hill, and the clamor of the rooks had begun to wane in the elm tops, he took my mother on his arm, and we trooped all together up the long straggling path, and across the grass, carrying our spoil of fruit into the cool dusky corridor. As we passed into the gloaming, I saw my mother stoop impulsively and kiss his arm. He brushed off her hand impatiently and went into his study. I heard the door shut. A moment afterwards he called for candles, and looking on those 2 other faces in the twilight, I knew with the intuition of childhood that he was suddenly sick to death of us all, and I knew that my mother shared my intuition. She sat down, and I beside her, in her little parlor, and took up her sewing. But her face had lost again all its girlishness as she bent her head over the white linen. I think she was happier when my father was away, for then, free from anxiety to be forever pleasing his variable moods, she could entertain herself with hopes and preparations for his return. There was a little green summer-house or arbor in the garden, where she would sit alone while the swallows coursed in the evening air. Sometimes, too, she would take me for a long walk, listening distantly to my chatter, only I think that she might entertain the pleasure of supposing that my father might have returned home unforeseen, and be even now waiting to greet us. But these fancies would forsake her. She would speak harshly and coldly to me, and scold Martha for her owlishness, and find nothing but vanity and mockery in all that but a little while since had been her daydream. I think she rarely knew where my father stayed in his long absences from home. He would remain with us for a week, and neglect us for a month. She was too proud, and when he was himself, too happy and hopeful to question him, and he seemed to delight in keeping his affairs secret from her. Indeed, he sometimes appeared to pretend a mystery where none was, and to endeavor in all things to make his character and conduct appear quixotic and inexplicable. So time went on. Yet it seemed, as each month passed by, the house was not so merry and happy as before. Something was fading and vanishing that would not return. Estrangement had pierced a little deeper. I think care at last put out of my mother's mind even the semblance of her former gaiety. She sealed up her heart, lest love should break forth anew into the bleakness. On Guy Fawkes' Day, Martha told me at bedtime that a new household had moved into the village on the other side of the heath. After that, my father stayed away from us but seldom. At first, my mother showed her pleasure in 1,000 ways, with dainties of her own fancy and cooking, with ribbons in her dark hair, with new songs, though she had but a small thin voice. She read to please him, and tired my legs out in useless errands in his service, and a word of praise sufficed her for many hours of difficulty. But by and by, when evening after evening was spent by my father away from home, she began to be uneasy and depressed, and though she made no complaint, her anxious face, the incessant interrogation of her eyes, vexed and irritated him beyond measure. "Where does my father go after dinner?" I asked Martha one night, when my mother was in my bedroom folding my clothes. "How dare you ask such a question?" said my mother, "and how dare you talk to the child about your master's comings and goings?" "But where does he?" I repeated to Martha when my mother was gone out of the room. "Shush now, Master Nicholas," she answered. "Didn't you hear what your mamma said? She's vexed, poor lady, at master's never spending a whole day at home, but nothing but them cards, 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 every night at Mr. Gray's. Why, often it's 12 and 1 in the morning when I've heard his foot on the gravel beneath the window. But there, I'll be bound, she doesn't mean to speak unkindly. It's a terrible scourge is jealousy, Master Nicholas, and not generous or manly to give it cause. Mrs. Ryder was kept a widow all along of jealousy, and but a week before her wedding with her second. But why is mother jealous of my father playing cards?" Martha slipped my nightgown over my head. "Shush, Master Nicholas. Little boys mustn't ask so many questions. And I hope when you are grown up to be a man, my dear, you will be a comfort to your mother. She needs it, poor soul, and sakes alive, just now of all times." I looked inquisitively into Martha's face, but she screened my eyes with her hand, and instead of further questions, I said my prayers to her. A few days after this, I was sitting with my mother in her parlor, holding her gray worsted for her to wind, when my father entered the room, and bade me put on my hat and muffler. "He is going to pay a call with me," he explained curtly. As I went out of the room, I heard my mother's question, "To your friends at the Grange, I suppose?" "You may suppose whatever you please," he answered. I heard my mother rise to leave the room, but he called her back, and the door was shut. The room in which the card-players sat was very low-ceiled. A piano stood near the window, a rosewood table, with a fine dark crimson work-basket upon it, by the fireside. and some little distance away a green card table with candles burning. Mr. Gray was a slim, elegant man, with a high, narrow forehead and long fingers. Major Aubrey was a short, red-faced, rather taciturn man. There was also a younger man with fair hair. They seemed to be on the best of terms together, and I helped to pack the cards and to pile the silver coins, sipping a glass of sherry with Mr. Gray. My father said little, paying me no attention, but playing gravely with a very slight frown. After some little while the door opened, and a lady appeared. This was Mr. Gray's sister, Jane, I learned. She seated herself at her work-table and drew me to her side. "Well, so this is Nicholas," she said, "or is it Nick?" "Nicholas," I said. "Of course," she said, smiling. "And I like that too, much the best. How very kind of you to come to see me. It was to keep me company, you know, because I am very stupid at games, but I love talking. Do you?" I looked into her eyes and knew we were friends. She smiled again with open lips and touched my mouth with her thimble. "Now let me see, business first, and me afterwards. You see I have 3 different kinds of cake, because I thought I cannot in the least tell which kind he'll like best. Could I now? Come, you shall choose." She rose and opened the long door of a narrow cupboard, looking towards the card-players as she stooped. I remember the cakes to this day, little oval shortbreads stamped with a beehive, custards and mince pies, and a great glass jar of goodies, which I carried in both arms round the little square table. I took a mince pie and sat down on a footstool near by Miss Gray, and she talked to me while she worked, with slender hands at her lace embroidery. I told her how old I was, about my great-aunt and her 3 cats. I told her my dreams, and that I was very fond of Yorkshire pudding, from under the meat, you know. And I told her I thought my father the handsomest man I had ever seen. "What, handsomer than Mr. Spencer?" she said, laughing, looking along her needle. I answered that I did not very much like clergymen. "And why?" she said gravely. "Because they do not talk like real," I said. She laughed very gaily. "Do men ever?" she said. And her voice was so quiet and so musical, her neck so graceful, I thought her a very beautiful lady, admiring especially her dark eyes when she smiled brightly, and yet half sadly at me. I promised, moreover, that if she would meet me on the heath, I would show her the rabbit warren and the miller's pool. "Well, Jane, and what do you think of my son?" said my father when we were about to leave. She bent over me and squeezed a lucky 4-penny piece into my hand. "I love 4-pence, pretty little 4-pence. I love 4-pence better than my life," she whispered into my ear. "But that's a secret," she added, glancing up over her shoulder. She kissed lightly the top of my head. I was looking at my father while she was caressing me, and I fancied a faint sneer passed over his face. But when we had come out of the village onto the heath, in the bare, keen night, as we walked along the path together between the gorse bushes, now on turf and now on stony ground, never before had he seemed so wonderful a companion. He told me little stories. He began 100 and finished none. Yet with the stars above us, they seemed a string of beads, all of bright colors. We stood still in the vast darkness, while he whistled that strangest of all old songs, the song the sirens sang. He pilfered my wits, and talked like my double. But when, how much too quickly I thought with sinking heart, we were come to the house gates, he suddenly fell silent, turned an instant, and stared far away over the windy heath. "How weary, stale, flat," he began, and broke off between uneasy laughter and a sigh. "Listen to me, Nicholas," he said, lifting my face to the starlight. "You must grow up a man. A man, you understand. No vaporings, no posings, no caprices, and above all, no sham. No sham! It's your one and only chance in this unfaltering scheme." He scanned my face long and closely. "You have your mother's eyes," he said musingly. "And that," he added under his breath, "that's no joke." He pushed open the squealing gate, and we went in. My mother was sitting in a low chair before a dying and cheerless fire. "Well, Nick," she said very suavely, "and how have you enjoyed your evening?" I stared at her without answer. "Did you play cards with the gentlemen, or did you turn over the music?" "I talked to Miss Gray," I said. "Really?" said my mother, raising her eyebrows. "And who then is Miss Gray?" My father was smiling at us with sparkling eyes. "Mr. Gray's sister," I answered in a low voice. "Not his wife, then?" said my mother, glancing furtively at the fire. I looked towards my father in doubt, but could lift my eyes no higher than his knees. "You little fool!" he said to my mother with a laugh. "What a sharpshooter! Never mind, Sir Nick. There, run off to bed, my man." My mother caught me roughly by the sleeve as I was passing her chair. "Aren't you going to kiss me good night, then?" she said furiously, her narrow underlip quivering. "You too!" I kissed her cheek. "That's right, my dear," she said scornfully. "That's how little fishes kiss." She rose and drew back her skirts. "I refuse to stay in the room," she said haughtily, and with a sob she hurried out. My father continued to smile, but only a smile it seemed gravity had forgotten to smooth away. He stood very still, so still that I grew afraid he must certainly hear me thinking. Then, with a kind of sigh, he sat down at my mother's writing table, and scribbled a few words with his pencil on a slip of paper. "There, Nicholas, just tap at your mother's door with that. Good night, old fellow." He took my hand and smiled down into my eyes with a kind of generous dark appeal that called me straight to his side. I hastened conceitedly upstairs and delivered my message. My mother was crying when she opened the door. "Well?" she said in a low, trembling voice. But presently afterwards, while I was still lingering in the dark corridor, I heard her run down quickly, and in a while my father and mother came upstairs together, arm in arm, and by her light talk and laughter you might suppose she had no knowledge of care or trouble at all. Never afterwards did I see so much gaiety and youthfulness in my mother's face as when she sat next morning with us at breakfast. The honeycomb, the small bronze chrysanthemums, her yellow gown seemed dainty as a miniature. With every word her eyes would glance covertly at my father, her smile, as it were, hesitating between her lashes. She was so light and girlish, and so versatile, I should scarcely have recognized the weary and sallow face of the night before. My father seemed to find as much pleasure or relief in her good spirits as I did, and to delight in exercising his ingenuity to quicken her humor. It was but a transient morning of sunshine, however, and as the brief and somber day waned, its gloom pervaded the house. In the evening my father left us to our solitude as usual, and that night was very misty over the heath, with a small warm rain falling. So it happened that I began to be left more and more to my own devices, and grew so inured at last to my own narrow company and small thoughts and cares, that I began to look on my mother's unhappiness almost with indifference, and learned to criticize almost before I had learned to pity. And so I do not think I enjoyed Christmas very much the less, although my father was away from home, and all our little festivities were dispirited. I had plenty of good things to eat, and presents, and a picture book from Martha. I had a new rocking horse. How changeless and impassive its mottled, battered face looks out at me across the years! It was brisk, clear weather, and on St. Stephen's Day I went to see if there was any ice yet on the miller's pool. I was stooping down at the extreme edge of the pool, snapping the brittle splinters of the ice with my finger, when I heard a voice calling me in the still air. It was Jane Grey, walking on the heath with my father, who had called me, having seen me from a distance stooping beside the water. "So you see I have kept my promise," she said, taking my hand. "But you promised to come by yourself," I said. "Well, so I will then," she answered, nodding her head. "Good-bye," she added, turning to my father. "It's three's none, you see. Nicholas shall take me home to tea, and you can call for him in the evening, if you will. That is, if you are coming." "Are you asking me to come?" he said moodily. "Do you care whether I come or not?" She lifted her face and spoke gravely. "You are my friend," she said. "Of course I care whether you are with me or not." He scrutinized her through half-closed lids. His face was haggard, gloomy with ennui. "How you harp on the word, you punctilious Jane! Do you suppose I am still in my teens? 20 years ago, now. It amuses me to hear you women talk. It's little you ever really feel." "I don't think I am quite without feeling," she replied. "You are a little difficult, you know." "Difficult!" he echoed in derision. He checked himself and shrugged his shoulders. "You see, Jane, it's all on the surface. I boast of my indifference. It's the one rag of philosophy age denies no one. It is so easy to be heroic, debonair, iron gray, fluent, dramatic. You know its captivation, perhaps. But after all, life's comedy, when one stops smiling, is only the tepidest farce. Or the gilt wears off, and the pinchbeck tragedy shows through. And so, as I say, we talk on, being past feeling. One by one our hopes come home to roost, our delusions find themselves out, and the mystery proves to be nothing but sleight of hand. It's age, my dear Jane, age. It turns one to stone. With you young people, life's a dream. Ask Nicholas here." He shrugged his shoulders, adding under his breath, "But one wakes on a devilish hard palate." "Of course," said Jane slowly, "you are only talking cleverly. And then it does not matter whether it's true or not, I suppose. I can't say. I don't think you mean it, and so it comes to nothing. I can't and won't believe you feel so little. I can't." She continued to smile, yet I fancied with the brightness of tears in her eyes. "It's all mockery and make-believe. We are not the miserable slaves of time you try to fancy. There must be some way to win through." She turned away, then added slowly, "You ask me to be fearless, sincere, to speak my heart. I wonder, do you?" My father did not look at her, appeared not to have seen the hand she had half held out to him, and as swiftly withdrawn. "The truth is, Jane," he said slowly, "I am past sincerity now. And as for heart, it is a quite discredited organ at 40. Life, thought, selfishness, egotism, call it what you will, they have all done their worst with me, and I really haven't the sentiment to pretend that they haven't. And when bright youth and sentiment are gone, why, go to, dear lady. Existence proves nothing but brazen inanity afterwards. But there's always that turning left to the dullest and dustiest road, oblivion." He remained silent a moment. Silence deep and strange lay all around us. The air was still, the wintry sky unutterably calm. And again that low, dispassionate voice continued, "It's only when right seems too easy a thing, too trivial and not worth the doing, and wrong a foolish thing, too dull. There, take care of her, Nicholas, take care of her. Snips and snails, you know. Au revoir. 'Pon my word, I almost wish it was good-bye." Jane Grey regarded him attentively. "So then do I," she replied in a low voice, "for I shall never understand you. Perhaps I should hate to understand you." My father turned with an affected laugh and left us. Miss Grey and I walked slowly along beside the frosty bulrushes until we came to the wood. The bracken and heather were faded. The earth was dark and rich with autumnal rains. Fir cones lay on the moss beneath the dark green branches. It was all now utterly silent in the wintry afternoon. Far away rose tardily and alighted the hoarse rooks upon the ploughed earth. High in the pale sky passed a few on ragged wing. "What does my father mean by wishing it was good-bye?" I said. But my companion did not answer me in words. She clasped my hand. She seemed very slim and gracious, walking by my side on the hardened ground. My mother was small now and awkward beside her in my imagination. I questioned her about the ice, about the red sky, and if there was any mistletoe in the woods. Sometimes she in turn asked me questions too, and when I answered them we would look at each other and smile. And it seemed it was with her as it was with me, of the pure gladness I found in her company. In the middle of our walk to the thorns, she bent down in the cold twilight, and putting her hands on my shoulders, "My dear, dear Nicholas," she said, "you must be a good son to your mother, brave and kind. Will you?" "He hardly ever speaks to mother now," I answered instinctively. She pressed her lips to my cheek, and her cheek was cold against mine, and she clasped her arms about me. "Kiss me," she said. "We must do our best, mustn't we?" she pleaded, still holding me. I looked mournfully into the gathering darkness. "That's easy when you're grown up," I said. She laughed and kissed me again, and then we took hands and ran, till we were out of breath, towards the distant lights of the thorns. I had been some time in bed, lying awake in the warmth, when my mother came softly through the darkness into my room. She sat down at the bedside, breathing hurriedly. "Where have you been all the evening?" she said. "Miss Grey asked me to stay to tea," I answered. "Did I give you permission to go to tea with Miss Grey?" I made no answer. "If you go to that house again, I shall beat you. You hear me, Nicholas? Alone or with your father, if you go there again without my permission, I shall beat you. You have not been whipped for a long time, have you?" I could not see her face, but her head was bent towards me in the dark, as she sat, almost crouched on my bedside. I made no answer. But when my mother had gone without kissing me, I cried noiselessly on into the pillow. Something had suddenly flown out of memory, never to sing again. Life had become a little colder and stranger. I had always been my own chief company. Now another sentimental barrier had arisen between the world and me, past its heedlessness, past my understanding to break down. Hardly a week passed now without some bitter quarrel. I seemed ever to be stealing out of sound of angry voices, ever fearful of being made the butt of my father's serene taunts, of my mother's passions and desperate remorse. He disdained to defend himself against her, never reasoned with her. He merely shrugged his shoulders, denied her charges, ignored her anger, coldly endeavoring only to show his indifference, to conceal by every means in his power his own inward weariness and vexation. I saw this, of course, only vaguely, yet with all a child's certainty of insight, though I rarely knew the cause of my misery, and I continued to love them both in my selfish fashion, not a whit the less. At last, on St. Valentine's Day, things came to a worse pass than before. It had always been my father's custom to hang my mother a valentine on the handle of her little parlor door, a string of pearls, a fan, a book of poetry, whatever it might be. She came down early this morning and sat in the window seat, looking out at the falling snow. She said nothing at breakfast, only feigned to eat, lifting her eyes at intervals to glance at my father with a strange intensity, as if of hatred, tapping her foot on the floor. He took no notice of her, sat quiet and moody with his own thoughts. I think he had not really forgotten the day, for I found long afterwards in his old bureau a bracelet purchased but a week before, with her name written on a scrap of paper inside the case. Yet it seemed to be the absence of this little gift that had driven my mother beyond reason. End of section 1. Part 2. Towards evening, tired of the house, tired of being alone, I went out and played a while listlessly in the snow. At nightfall I went in, and in the dark heard angry voices. My father came out of the dining room and looked at me in silence, standing in the gloom of the wintry dusk. My mother followed him. I can see her now, leaning in the doorway, white with rage, her eyes ringed and darkened with continuous trouble, her hand trembling. "It shall learn to hate you," she cried in a low, dull voice. "I will teach it every moment to hate and despise you, as I hate and despise you." My father looked at her calmly and profoundly before replying. He took up a cloth hat and brushed it with his hand. "Very well, then, you have chosen," he said coldly. "It has always lain with you. You have exaggerated, you have raved, and now you have said what can never be recalled or forgotten. Here's Nicholas. Pray do not imagine, however, that I am defending myself. I have nothing to defend. I think of no one but myself, no one. Endeavor to understand me, no one. Perhaps, indeed, you yourself know more than—" But words again. The dull old round. He made a peculiar gesture with his hand. "Well, life is—I have done. So be it." He stood looking out of the door. "You see, it's snowing," he said, as if to himself. All the long night before, and all day long, snow had been falling continuously. The air was wintry and cold. I could discern nothing beyond the porch but a gloomy accumulation of cloud in the twilight air, now darkened with the labyrinthine motion of the snow. My father glanced back for an instant into the house, and, as I fancy, regarded me with a kind of strange, close earnestness. But he went out, and his footsteps were instantly silenced. My mother peered at me in terrible perplexity, her eyes wide with terror and remorse. "What? What?" she said. I stared at her stupidly. 3 snowflakes swiftly and airily floated together into the dim hall from the gloom without. She clasped her hand over her mouth. Overburdened her fingers seemed to be, so slender were they with her many rings. "Nicholas, Nicholas, tell me! What was I saying? What was I saying?" She stumbled hastily to the door. "Arthur, Arthur!" she cried from the porch. "It's St. Valentine's Day. That was all I meant. Come back, come back!" But perhaps my father was already out of hearing. I do not think he made any reply. My mother came in doubtfully, resting her hand on the wall, and she walked very slowly and laboriously upstairs. While I was standing at the foot of the staircase, looking out across the hall into the evening, Martha climbed primly up from the kitchen with her lighted taper, shut to the door, and lit the hall lamp. Already the good smell of the feast cooking floated up from the kitchen, and gladdened my spirits. "Will he come back?" Martha said, looking very scared in the light of her taper. "It's such a fall of snow. Already it's a hand's breadth on the window sill. Oh, Master Nicholas, it's a hard world for us women." She followed my mother upstairs, carrying light to all the gloomy upper rooms. I sat down in the window seat of the dining room and read in my picture book as well as I could by the flame light. By and by Martha returned to lay the table. As far back as brief memory carried me, it had been our custom to make a Valentine's feast on the saint's day. This was my father's mother's birthday also. When she was alive, I well remember her visiting us with her companion, Miss Schreiner, who talked in such good-humored English to me. This same anniversary had, last year, brought about a tender reconciliation between my father and mother, after a quarrel that meant how little then. And I remember on this day to have seen the first fast-sealed buds upon the almond tree. We would have a great spangled cake in the middle of the table, with marzipan and comfits, just as at Christmas-tide. And when Mrs. Mare lived in the village, her little fair daughters used to come in a big carriage to spend the evening with us, and to share my Valentine's feast. But all this was changed now. My wits were sharper, but I was none the less only the duller for that. My hopes and dreams had a little fallen and faded. I looked idly at my picture book, vaguely conscious that its colors pleased me less than once upon a time, that I was rather tired of seeing them, and they just as tired of seeing me. And yet I had nothing else to do, so I must go on with a hard face, turning listlessly the pictured pages. About 7 o'clock my mother sent for me. I found her sitting in her bedroom. Candles were burning before the looking-glass. She was already dressed in her handsome black silk gown, and wearing her pearl necklace. She began to brush my hair, curling its longer ends with her fingers, which she moistened in the pink bowl that was one of the first things I had set eyes on in this world. She put me on a clean blouse and my buckled shoes, talking to me the while, almost as if she were telling me a story. Then she looked at herself long and earnestly in the glass, throwing up her chin with a smile, as was a habit of hers in talk. I wandered about the room, fingering the little toilette boxes and knick-knacks on the table. By mischance I upset one of these, a scent bottle that held rose water. The water ran out and filled the warm air with its fragrance. "You foolish, clumsy boy!" said my mother, and slapped my hand. More out of vexation and tiredness than because of the pain, I began to cry. And then with infinite tenderness she leaned her head on my shoulder. "Mother can't think very well just now," she said, and cried so bitterly in silence that I was only too ready to extricate myself and run away when her hold on me relaxed. I climbed slowly upstairs to Martha's bedroom, and kneeling on a cane chair, looked out of the window. The flakes had ceased to fall now, although the snowy heath was encompassed in mist. Above the snow the clouds had parted, drifting from beneath the stars, and these in their constellations were trembling very brightly, and here and there burned one of them in solitude, larger and wilder in its shining than the rest. But though I did not tire of looking out of the window, my knees began to ache, and the little room was very cold, and still so near the roof. So I went down to the dining room, with all its 7 candlesticks kindled, seeming to my unaccustomed eyes a very splendid blaze out of the dark. My mother was kneeling on the rug by the fireside. She looked very small, even dwarfish, I thought. She was gazing into the flames, one shoe curved beneath the hem of her gown, her chin resting on her hand. I surveyed the table, with its jellies and sweetmeats, and glasses and fruit, and began to be very hungry, so savory was the smell of the turkey roasting downstairs. Martha knocked at the door when the clock had struck 8. "Dinner is ready, ma'am." My mother glanced fleetingly at the clock. "Just a little, only a very little while longer. Tell Mrs. Ryder. Your master will be home in a minute." She rose and placed the claret in the hearth at some distance from the fire. "Is it nicer warm, mother?" I asked. She looked at me with startled eyes and nodded. "Did you hear anything, Nicholas?" run to the door and listen. Was that a sound of footsteps? I opened the outer door and peered into the darkness, but it seemed the world ended here with the warmth and the light. Beyond could extend only winter and silence. A region that, familiar though it was to me, seemed now to terrify me like an enormous sea. "It's stopped snowing," I said, "but there isn't anybody there. Nobody at all, Mother." The hours passed heavily from quarter on to quarter. The turkey, I grieved to hear, was to be taken out of the oven and put away to cool in the pantry. I was bidden help myself to what I pleased of the trembling jellies and delicious pink blancmange. Already midnight would be the next hour to be chimed. I felt sick, yet was still hungry and very tired. The candles began to burn low. "Leave me a little light here, then," my mother said at last to Martha, "and go to bed. Perhaps your master has missed his way home in the snow." But Mrs. Ryder had followed Martha into the room. "You must pardon my interference, ma'am, but it isn't right. It isn't really right of you to sit up longer. Master will not come back, maybe, before morning, and I shouldn't be doing my bounden duty, ma'am, except I spoke my mind, just now, too, of all times." "Thank you very much, Mrs. Ryder," my mother answered simply, "but I would prefer not to go to bed yet. It's very lonely on the heath at night, but I shall not want anything else, thank you." "Well, ma'am, I've had my say, and done my conscience's bidding, and I have brought you up this tumbler of mulled wine, else you'll be sinking away or something with the fatigue." My mother took the wine, sipped of it with a wan smile at Mrs. Ryder over the brim, and Mrs. Ryder retired with Martha. I don't think they had noticed me sitting close in the shadow on my stool beside the table. But all through that long night, I fancy, these good souls took it in turn to creep down stealthily and look in on us. And in the small hours of the morning, when the fire had fallen low, they must have wrapped us both warm in shawls. They left me then, I think, to be my mother's company. Indeed, I remember we spoke in the darkness, and she took my hand. My mother and I shared the steaming wine together when they were gone, our shadows looming faintly huge upon the ceiling. We said very little, but I looked softly into her gray, childish eyes, and we kissed one another kneeling there together before the fire. And afterwards I jigged softly round the table, pilfering whatever sweet or savory mouthful took my fancy. But by and by in the silent house, a silence broken only by the fluttering of the flames, and the odd far-away stir of the frost, drowsiness vanquished me. I sat down by the fireside, leaning my head on a chair, and sitting thus, vaguely eyeing firelight and wavering shadow, I began to nod, and very soon dreams stalked in, mingling with reality. It was early morning when I awoke, dazed and cold, and miserable in my uncomfortable resting place. The rare odor of frost was on the air. The ashes of the fire lay iron gray upon the cold hearth. An intensely clear white ray of light leaned up through a cranny of the shutters to the cornice of the ceiling. I got up with difficulty. My mother was still asleep, breathing heavily, and as I stooped, regarding her curiously, I could almost watch her transient dreams fleeting over her face. And now she smiled faintly, and now she raised her eyebrows as if in some playful and happy talk with my father. Then again utterly still darkness would descend on brow and lid and lip. I touched her sleeve, suddenly conscious of my loneliness in the large house. Her face clouded instantly. She sighed profoundly. "What?" she said. "Nothing? Nothing?" She stretched out her hand towards me. The lids drew back from eyes still blind from sleep. But gradually time regained its influence over her. She moistened her lips and turned to me, and suddenly, in a gush of agony, remembrance of the night returned to her. She hid her face in her hands, rocking her body gently to and fro, then rose and smoothed back her hair at the looking-glass. I was surprised to see no trace of tears on her cheeks. Her lips moved, as if unconsciously a heart worn out with grief addressed that pale reflection of her sorrow in the glass. I took hold of the hand that hung down listlessly on her silk skirt and fondled it, kissing punctiliously each loose ring in turn. But I do not think she heeded my kisses, so I returned to the table on which was still set out the mockery of our Valentine feast, strangely disenchanted in the chill dusk of daybreak. I put a handful of wine biscuits and a broken piece of cake in my pocket, for a determination had taken me to go out on to the heath. My heart beat thick and fast in imagination of the solitary snow, and of myself wandering in loneliness across its untrampled surface. A project also was forming in my mind of walking over to the thorns, for somehow I knew my mother would not scold or punish me that day. Perhaps I thought my father would be there, and I would tell Miss Grey all about my adventure of the night spent down in the dining-room. So moving very stealthily, and betraying no eagerness lest I should be forbidden to go, I stole at length unperceived from the room, and leaving the great hall door ajar, ran out joyously into the wintry morning. Already dawn was clear and high in the sky. Already the first breezes were moving in the mists, and breathed chill, as if it were the lingering darkness itself on my cheeks. The air was cold, yet with a fresh, faint sweetness. The snow lay crisp across its perfect surface, mounded softly over the gorse bushes, though here and there a spray of parched blossom yet protruded from its cowl. Flaky particles of ice floated invisible in the air. I called out with pleasure to see the little ponds where the snow had been blown away from the black ice. I saw on the bushes, too, the webs of spiders stretched from thorn to thorn, and festooned with crystals of hoar frost. I turned and counted as far as I could my footsteps leading back to the house, which lay roofed in gloomy pallor, dim and obscured in the darkened west. A waning moon that had risen late in the night shone, it seemed, very near to the earth, but every moment light swept invincibly in, pouring its crystal like a river, and darkness sullenly withdrew into the north. And when at last the sun appeared, glittering along the rosy snow, I turned in an ecstasy, and with my finger pointed him out, as if the house I had left behind me might view him with my own delight. Indeed, I saw its windows transmuted, and heard afar a thrush pealing in the bare branches of a pear-tree, and a robin startled me, so suddenly shrill and sweet he broke into song from a snowy tuft of gorse. I was now come to the beginning of a gradual incline, from the summit of which I should presently descry in the distance the avenue of lindens that led towards the village from the margin of the heath. As I went on my way, munching my biscuits, looking gaily about me, I brooded deliciously on the breakfast which Miss Grey would doubtless sit me down to, and almost forgot the occasion of my errand, and the troubled house I had left behind me. At length I climbed to the top of the smooth ridge, and looked down. At a little distance from me grew a crimson hawthorn tree that often in past Aprils I had used for a green tent from the showers, but now it was closely hooded, darkening with its faint shadow the long expanse of unshadowed whiteness. Not very far from this bush I perceived a figure lying stretched along the snow, and knew instinctively that this was my father lying here. The sight did not then surprise or dismay me. It seemed but the lucid sequel to that long, heavy night watch, to all the troubles and perplexities of the past. I felt no sorrow, but stood beside the body, regarding it only with deep wonder and a kind of earnest curiosity, yet perhaps with a remote pity too, that he could not see me in the beautiful morning. His gray hand lay arched in the snow. His darkened face, on which showed a smear of dried blood, was turned away a little, as if out of the oblique sunshine. I understood that he was dead, was already loosely speculating on what changes it would make, how I should spend my time, what would happen in the house now that he was gone, his influence, his authority, his discord. I remembered, too, that I was alone, was master of this immense secret, that I must go home sedately, as if it were a Sunday, and in a low voice tell my mother, concealing any exultation I might feel in the office. I imagined the questions that would be asked me, and was considering the proper answers to make to them, when my morbid dreams were suddenly broken in on by Martha Rodd. She stood in my footsteps, looking down on me from the ridge from which I had but just now descended. She hastened toward me, stooping a little as if she carried a burden, her mouth ajar, her forehead wrinkled beneath its wispy light brown hair. "Look, Martha, look!" I cried. "I found him in the snow. He's dead." And suddenly a bond seemed to snap in my heart. The beauty and solitude of the morning, the perfect whiteness of the snow, it was all an uncouth mockery against me, a subtle and quiet treachery. The tears gushed into my eyes, and in my fear and affliction I clung to the poor girl, sobbing bitterly, protesting my grief, hiding my eyes in terror from that still inscrutable shape. She smoothed my hair with her hand again and again, her eyes fixed, and then at last, venturing cautiously nearer, she stooped over my father. "Oh, Master Nicholas," she said, "his poor dark hair! What will we do now? What will your poor mamma do now, and him gone?" She hid her face in her hands, and our tears gushed out anew. But my grief was speedily forgotten. The novelty of being left entirely alone, my own master, to go where I would, to do as I pleased, the experience of being pitied most when I least needed it, and then, when misery and solitariness came over me like a cloud, of being utterly ignored, turned my thoughts gradually away. My father's body was brought home and laid in my mother's little parlor that looked out onto the garden and the snowy orchard. The house was darkened. I took a secret pleasure in peeping in on the sunless rooms, and stealing from door to door through corridors screened from the daylight. My mother was ill, and for some inexplicable reason I connected her illness with the bevy of gentlemen dressed in black, who came one morning to the house and walked away together over the heath. Finally, Mrs. Marshall drove up one afternoon from Islington, and by the bundles she had brought with her, and her grained box with the iron handles, I knew that she was come, as once before in my experience, to stay. I was playing on the morrow in the hall with my leaden soldiers, when there came into my mind vaguely the voices of Mrs. Ryder and of Mrs. Marshall gossiping together on their tedious way upstairs from the kitchen. "No, Mrs. Marshall, nothing," I heard Mrs. Ryder saying. "Not one word, not one word." And now the poor dear lady left quite alone, and only the doctor to gainsay that fatherless mite from facing the idle inquisitive questions of all them strangers. "It's neither for me nor you, Mrs. Marshall, to speak out just what comes into our heads here and now. The ways of the Almighty are past understanding, but a kinder at heart never trod this earth." "Ah," said Mrs. Marshall. "I knew to my sorrow," continued Mrs. Ryder, "there was words in the house, but there, wheresoever you be, there's that. Human beings ain't angels, married or single, and in every— Wasn't there talk of some— insinuated Mrs. Marshall discreetly. "Talk, Mrs. Marshall," said Mrs. Ryder, coming to a standstill. "I scorn the word. A pinch of truth and a hogshead of falsehood. I don't gainsay it even. I just shut my ears, there, with the dead." Mrs. Marshall had opened her mouth to reply when I was discovered, crouched as small as possible at the foot of the stairs. "Well, here's pictures," said Mrs. Marshall pleasantly, "and this is the poor fatherless mannikin, I suppose. It's hard on the innocent, Mrs. Ryder, and him grown such a sturdy child, too, as I said from the first. Well now, and don't you remember me, little man? Don't you remember Mrs. Marshall? He ought to now." "He's a very good boy in general," said Mrs. Ryder, "and I'm sure I hope and pray he'll grow up to be a comfort to his poor widowed mother, if so be." They glanced earnestly at one another, and Mrs. Marshall stooped with a sigh of effort, and drew a big leather purse from a big loose pocket under her skirt, and selected a bright halfpenny from among its silver and copper. "I make no doubt he will, poor mite," she said cheerfully. I took the halfpenny in silence, and the two women passed slowly upstairs. In the afternoon, in order to be beyond call of Martha, I went out onto the heath with a shovel, intent on building a great tomb in the snow. Yet more snow had fallen during the night. It now lay so deep as to cover my socks above my shoes. I labored very busily, shoveling, beating, molding, stamping. So intent was I that I did not see Miss Gray until she was close beside me. I looked up from the snow, and was surprised to find the sun already set, and the low mists of evening approaching. Miss Gray was veiled and dressed in furs to the throat. She drew her ungloved hand from her muff. "Nicholas," she said in a low voice. I stood for some reason confused and ashamed without answering her. She sat down on my shapeless mound of snow and took me by the hand. Then she drew up her veil, and I saw her face pale and darkened, and her dark eyes gravely looking into mine. "My poor, poor Nicholas," she said, and continued to gaze at me with her warm hand clasping mine. "What can I say? What can I do? Isn't it very, very lonely out here in the snow?" "I didn't feel lonely much," I answered. I was playing at building." "And I am sitting on your beautiful snow house, then," she said, smiling sadly, her hand trembling upon mine. "It isn't a house," I answered, turning away. She pressed my hand on the furs at her throat. "Poor cold blue hands," she said. "Do you like playing alone?" "I like you being here," I answered. "I wish you would come always, or at least sometimes." She drew me close to her, smiling, and bent and kissed my head. "There," she said, "I am here now." "Mother's ill," I said. She drew back and looked out over the heath towards the house. "They have put my father in the little parlor in his coffin. Of course you know he's dead. And Mrs. Marshall's come. She gave me a halfpenny this morning. Dr. Graham gave me a whole crown, though." I took it out of my breeches pocket and showed it her. "That's very, very nice," she said. "What lots of nice things you can buy with it. And look, I am going to give you a little keepsake, too, between just you and me." It was a small silver box that she drew out of her muff, and embossed in the silver of the lid was a crucifix. "I thought perhaps I should see you today, you know," she continued softly. "Now, who's given you this?" she said, putting the box into my hand. "You," I answered softly. "And who am I?" "Miss Gray," I said. "Your friend, Jane Gray," she repeated, as if she were fond of her own name. "Say it now. Always my friend, Jane Gray." I repeated it after her. "And now," she continued, "tell me which room is the little parlor. Is it that small window at the corner under the ivy?" I shook my head. "Which?" she said in a whisper after a long pause. I twisted my shovel in the snow. "Would you like to see my father?" I said. I am sure you know Martha would not mind, and mother's in bed." She started and looked with quiet dark eyes into my face. "Where?" she said, without stirring. "It's at the back, a little window that comes out. If you were to come this evening, I would be playing in the hall. I always play in the hall after tea, if I can, and now always. Nobody would see you at all, you know." She sighed. "Oh, what are you saying?" she said, and stood up, drawing down her veil. "But would you like to?" I repeated. She stooped suddenly, pressing her veiled face to mine. I'll come," she said, her face utterly changed, so close to my eyes. "We can both still be loyal to him, can't we, Nicholas?" She walked away quickly towards the pool and the little darkened wood. I looked after her and knew that she would be waiting there alone till evening. I looked at my silver box with great satisfaction, and after opening it, put it into my pocket with my crown piece and my halfpenny, and continued my building for a while. But now zest for it was gone, and I began to feel cold, the frost closing in keenly as darkness gathered. So I went home. My silence and suspicious avoidance of scrutiny and question passed unnoticed. Indeed, I ate my tea in solitude, except that now and again one or other of the women would come bustling in on some brief errand. A peculiar suppressed stir was in the house. I wondered what could be the cause of it, and felt a little timid and anxious of my project being discovered. None the less I was playing in the evening, as I had promised, close to the door, alert to catch the faintest sign of the coming of my visitor. "Run down in the kitchen, dearie," said Martha. Her cheeks were flushed. She was carrying a big can of steaming water. "You must keep very, very quiet this evening, and go to bed like a good boy, and perhaps tomorrow morning I'll tell you a great, great secret." She kissed me with hasty rapture. I was not especially inquisitive of her secret just then, and eagerly promised to be quite quiet if I might continue to play where I was. "Well, very, very quiet then, and you mustn't let Mrs. Marshall—" she began, but hurried hastily away in answer to a peremptory summons from upstairs. Almost as soon as she was gone, I heard a light rap on the door. It seemed that Jane Grey brought in with her the cold and freshness of the woods. I led the way on tiptoe down the narrow corridor and into the small, silent room. The candles burned pure and steadfastly in their brightness. The air was still and languid with the perfume of flowers. Overhead passed light, heedful footsteps, but they seemed not a disturbing sound, only a rumor beyond the bounds of silence. "I am very sorry," I said, "but they have nailed it down. Martha says the men came this afternoon." Miss Grey took a little bunch of snowdrops from her bosom and hid them in among the clustered wreaths of flowers, and she knelt down on the floor with a little silver cross which she sometimes wore pressed tight to her lips. I felt ill at ease to see her praying, and wished I could go back to my soldiers. But while I watched her, seeing in marvelous brilliancy everything in the little room, and remembering dimly the snow lying beneath the stars in the darkness of the garden, I listened also to the quiet footsteps passing to and fro in the room above. Suddenly the silence was broken by a small, continuous, angry crying. Miss Grey looked up. Her eyes were very clear and wonderful in the candlelight. "What was that?" she said faintly, listening. I stared at her. The cry welled up anew, piteously, as if of a small, remote, helpless indignation. "Why, it sounds just like a little baby," I said. She crossed herself hastily and arose. "Nicholas," she said in a strange, quiet, bewildered voice, yet her face was most curiously bright. She looked at me lovingly and yet so strangely, I wished I had not let her come in. She went out as she had entered. I did not so much as peep into the darkness after her, but busy with 100 thoughts, returned to my play. Long past my usual bedtime, as I sat sipping a mug of hot milk before the glowing cinders of the kitchen fire, Martha told me her secret. So my impossible companion in the High Street yesterday was own and only brother to your crazy old friend Richard, said the Count. His only brother, he added, in a muse. End of Section 2.